to meet you all more.
Pleasure, yeah.
So let me know when we're ready. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Our today's topic is, it's over an hour, and I think, or at least over the next hour, it's urgent and it's important. I think if you're reading the Keeping Up with the News or even your just own lived experience, then you know that at the top of most people's mind is housing, whether it's affordable, can I keep my home, can I buy a home? And so today we gather to talk about the current housing crisis and the historic situation we find ourselves in that's really exacerbated the housing market as it relates to inflation, high interest rates, and then the combined with rapid speculation that's actually removing affordable units from the market at alarming rates, and especially in communities of color. And so our hope is that we know that this is an extraordinary, challenging environment for everyone seeking affordable housing. But I'm hopeful that you are all here, our panelists who are going to help us solve this problem nationally, but for sure we're going to dissect it in this conversation. What we see everywhere, it's not just in the high cost markets, New York, the Bay Area, LA, across the entire country, there's not a single place where families, working families, can actually afford housing. And so this is not just a coastal issue or high cost issue. It's really, it's an issue everywhere in the country. Increasingly, local governments are coming to LISC for solutions. They're asking us, what do we know about how we can help to address this problem? In some instances, these are places that have historically not had a particularly high focus on affordable housing, but whether they have or they haven't, the issue for all of us is to try to find a solution. Solutions that get us to scale, not only in terms of production, but also a focus on preservation, because we are concerned that so much of what was built to be affordable is no longer affordable. So we're concerned about preserving the affordability of existing units that are affordable, as well as creating more. There is lots of federal dollars, state, city dollars, government dollars that can be directed toward housing, but a lot more capacity that needs to be built in order to drive those dollars into communities in an equitable way, as well as to address the depth of affordability that we need to consider. So I'm really pleased to have such a great slate of speakers from across the country who have decided to talk to us today, to talk with us, and to help us understand the issue and to come up with more solutions. And so with that, I turn the mic over to our VP, who has headed up this whole effort and put this conversation together. He's the VP of Community Solutions and Research for LISC, David Greenberg. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Denise. So I'm going to then introduce our panelists, if that makes sense. And we're going to hear directly from them. So if you just give me 1 second to queue up my notes. First, we're going to be hearing from Shanika Henderson and Roberto de la Riva of Inquilinos Unidos. Roberto is co-executive director, and Shanika Henderson is a tenant leader with IX, which was founded in 2015 And it convenes Minneapolis tenants to analyze their housing problems, strategize, organize, and mobilize around those problems, and create affordable and dignified homes. IX engage landlords wherever possible, but when they refuse to address problems in their buildings, IX creates pressure through court, public education campaigns, and direct action. IX works for permanently affordable democratic housing and structural changes through tenant unions, rent control, stronger enforcement, and cooperatively owned housing. In one of those campaigns, in a multi-year fight covered by sources such as the New York Times, a group of tenants organized against one of the most powerful landlords in Minneapolis, and they bought their buildings with the collaboration of Land Bank Twin Cities and with the involvement of LISC Twin Cities, forming the Sky Without Limits Cooperative, or SWL. SWL exists 3 blocks from the burned police precinct, where members are confronting the gentrification of South Minneapolis. And the cooperative is building a community based on the principles of autonomy, justice, and dignity within a fair and democratic process. Next, we'll be hearing from Alora Lee Raymond, who is coming to us from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Alora is an urban planner and assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning in the College of Design at Georgia Tech. She is interested in the financialization of housing and property in land, displacement, and dispossession through housing systems, housing and disasters, housing justice, race, segregation, and the transnational Pacific Islander community. Dr. Raymond has explored widening housing wealth inequality following the real estate and financial crises of the 2000s, and the relationship between financialization of rental housing and eviction-led displacement. She has studied the effect of the foreclosure and affordability crises on Pacific Islander communities in Los Angeles, as well as the financialization of customary land in Samoa. Dr. Raymond has ongoing projects on housing, displacement, and disasters, which includes work on eviction and migration following disasters. And she's published articles in Cityscape, the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, Urban Geography, Housing Studies, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's Community and Economic Development Discussion Paper Series. And her research has been featured in many popular educations and news outlets. Finally, we'll be hearing from Heather Voga from ProPublica. She is a reporter there and is currently investigating the rental housing market. Previously, she wrote about President Donald Trump's business entanglements and collaborated with reporters at WNYC on the podcast Trump Inc. Her 2019 stories on discrepancies between what the Trump organization told New York City property tax officials and what it reported on loan documents won an award from the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. She's exposed abuse at group homes for the developmentally disabled and high schools that push out low achievers to goose their graduation rates. Previously, she was a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where her work on test cheating in the public school system resulted in the indictments of the superintendent and 34 others. A series she co-authored called Cheating Our Children, examining suspicious test schools in public schools, was a 2013 finalist for the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting. And she's received a Sigma Delta Chi Award for non-deadline reporting, the Hillman Prize, and multiple Education Writers Association awards for investigative work. So thank you to all of our panelists, but let's start, as this webinar is entitled Tenant Power, Private Equity and the Eviction Crisis, from the perspective of tenant power. And so that's where we're going to hear from IX about their work organizing in this space. Roberto and Shanika, thank you for talking to all of us.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. So beautiful to be with you today. I'm kind of in an echoey room, but hope it works out well. Thanks to LISC and thanks to everybody coming on the call, all the panelists. Just being here today, being present and trying to push for something different. We all know that this is really intense on our souls, on our bodies. And I wanted to give just a little bit of introduction of Inquilinos Unidos, who we are, how we came to organize against Progress Residential, and then move it to Shanika, who has been steadfast on the north side of Minneapolis. I'm coming out right now from George Floyd Free Square. We have 3 offices as Inquilinos Unidos, one in George Floyd Square. We've always been here in the last 7 years since we started the organization, one in our cooperative, and then one on the north side of Minneapolis. Something that I just want to highlight today when it comes to private equity is the invincible amount of money that they have. And what does it mean to organize against that? And so first, I want to start, though, by thinking about how we started. We started 8 years ago in a neighborhood, Lindale neighborhood, talking to renters, because there's more than 7,000 renters in that neighborhood, about the problems that they were facing against their slumlord. And this is a landlord who would fine children for playing in the green space, who would fine, immigrants, refugees, in the most wild of ways, had an illegal billing system. And all of the buildings that this landlord had were tier 1 buildings. Millions of dollars that the city had put into practice to say that these buildings were the best buildings in Minneapolis. But when we came to organizing them with people of color, they were the worst. So how does the system work in such a way where we're seeing the best buildings with some of the worst treatment? How does that happen? And I think as we started to organize, we started to see and become uncomfortable friends of many people. The city, the landlords, the nonprofits, all these kinds of different people, because we were seeing some of the contradictions that they were laying out. And something that I want to say is that, we can talk about naturally occurring affordable housing. But what was clear to me in the process of 8 years is this is naturally occurring profitable housing. The landlord was getting 70-cent profit margins off people of color, refugees, people coming out of shelters for the first time, single mothers, and no one was doing anything about it. Everyone was participating in this. And so what we started doing is organizing against corporate landlords. We didn't just organize against mom and pop landlords. Landlords who own 69 buildings, 1,500 units, 5,000 families. Landlords who own 30 buildings. And as we started to bring the people together in these buildings who had a big market share in Minneapolis, we started to see some common things. We started to see that when you come together, you can fight back against anything. And we also started to see some of the weaknesses in the system that was just kind of holding the landlords not accountable at all. And so I think a big lesson here is that we're coming out of the foreclosure crisis in 2008. And I want to put this in front of people's heads. This was the greatest loss of wealth of people of color in history. Now, if we're coming off that in 2008, who's going to buy these homes? Who's going to buy the homes, the apartment buildings, the people that are losing in this big loss? And so we're starting to see kind of a really intense transference of power into some of these big companies. And so after we won a $13 million lawsuit, after we got the landlord to sell the buildings back to create a cooperative, after we actually want rent control in some of these corporate portfolios, what we started to do is think about how we're going to organize a lot bigger. And then we decided to go after a landlord who owns 80,000 homes. I mean, this is unreal. 80,000 homes and 215 homes in just a small section of the north side of Minneapolis. These 215 homes, if you make an estimate, it's more than $60 million in a small little place. And so from there, I want to move to Shanika to talk a little bit about what the organizing looks like against Progress Residential, Aries Management, and how it's felt to live in the homes of Havenbrook and then become an organizer in those homes.
Hello. Again, my name is Shanika Henderson. I live on the north side. I am also a tenant of Progress Residential, and I have been part of United Renters Justice for about 2 years now. I got involved due to the fact that I was door knocked by United Renters for Justice, and they had a very unique story. They wanted to know how long I had been living in my home, what are some of the things that I had been faced with, and also told me that there were several neighbors that were also renters of Progress that were on my same block. I had no idea. But I knew that I needed to be a part of this organization because I was actually waking up and seeing homes that were for sale. They were actually being sold the next day. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to know who was this company that was just buying up these homes that I'd known, that I had also known to be owned by Black people. And they had been in the neighborhoods for about 15 to 20 years. And I didn't even see them move. I didn't know that they were moving out or even selling their homes. And the next day, like I said, literally, they were being bought by Progress / back about a year ago, Havenbrook. So when I noticed that, I knew that I needed to be a part of this organization, and I wanted to do something for my neighbors. So what I started doing was organizing in the north side of Minneapolis. In about 2020, summer 2020, I met Roberto, and also some great other people involved in the organization, Jen Arnold. They were some powerful people. And I was actually scared because I'm like, I'm gonna speak against this landlord that I'm renting from. I've been here for 7 years. I'm paying over $1,700 each month in rent. I have 3 kids. And also I was actually giving birth to a son that was born premature. He was only 1 pound. And I had a heart-wrenching story to tell Progress that I needed to move out of this home, and they were not even hearing me. I hadn't been late on a rent payment. I had also had things that were happening into the neighborhood that were keeping me and my family very unsafe. And when I got out on the streets of the north side of Minneapolis, I started organizing really, really hard. And I was aware that I was not the only one having these issues with Havenbrook, far as repair issues. And people were living like, it was just heart-wrenching to see how people were paying even $2,000 in rent in this neighborhood that I had been renting from for the last 8 years. I actually am still renting from them. So it's kind of sad to say that people are still scared to kind of stand up against this company, but we have gotten people to stand up, a lot of people that I didn't think that would. And we have won people's new homes to move in to. People have even gotten money back for years that they have put into these unjustable homes to live in. People were just living with lead. People who had kids that were at least 2 years old that had some type of injuries in the home, homes that were shot up. Even my homes were shot into, and this company just ignored us. So we actually protested against the company. We got a lot of renters involved, and we hit we hit Progress really hard. We actually went to their office, and we were really, really excited. We were angry. We were passionate. I mean, anything that you can think of that people should feel by having unjustified housing situations. We fought, and we made sure that our point was heard, and they didn't like it. They actually called the police, and the police was very nice. They were on our side. They let us stay. They let us get our point across. The news was there to get these stories out. And I've also been on a lot of the news channels here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to put my story out. And I said I was not going to be silenced by them anymore. And I wanted people to know that they're not fighting alone, and we are going to win in any way that we can. If it's whatever the people want, that is involved in the Northside organization, we want to be able to let them know that we want to fight for them, and we want justice, and we want to win. And we have been getting that. The word has been spread all over. I'm just like breathless when it comes to the work that we've done with actually getting this company exposed, and having some of the investors like MSBI not to invest. We speak up at these investor meetings. We let them know that, hey, this is a crummy company. They are stealing wealth out of our community, which is predominantly a Black community. They don't care. They just see dollars, and we want to expose them in any way that we can. And we speak the truth, and we have power behind our words. And every time we fight against this company, we win. They're calling tenants to see what they can do to actually hush them up. And our tenants are like, you can fix this, but we're going to continue to fight for all of the hundreds and hundreds of homes that you own in the state of Minnesota just alone. I've actually been to Washington to actually work with some of the senators and the mayors to expose them even more and to let them know, stop investing in this company. And I'm just glad that I can be involved, and I'm here and I'm committed to this.
And thank you, Shanika. I think the last thing that I just want to add is that, you know, you can organize in multifamily, which we do really well, and you can organize in single family, which we do really well as well. But I think the thing about it is that both different places that you organize, you're always going to break down isolation. The system creates isolation. We have to break through fear and bring people together. But what's clear to me is that when you have people paying, they're paying for a $400,000 mortgage and they can't get out of the renting business. And it's just very clear to see that you have families that are being held back by these large corporations. And the second thing is that now there's pensions in these corporations, there's school systems, there's, you know, public utility systems that are actually investing into these companies that are destroying families. And so there are different leverages that we can talk about saying, you know, where we can put our money in. But the problem is that these pensions are making so much money on these housing portfolios that it's a caveat because they're getting so much return on their investment. And so what do we need to do as an organization, as people thinking together, to actually make sure that our public pensions are protected without going into making other people in a bad place, and at the same time thinking of something else?
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Shanika and Roberto, for those incredibly powerful reflections, both about what it takes to bring people together, as you're saying, and to overcome isolation, to build power, to fight for your rights, and also to identify, as you were just saying, Roberto, the policy levers that can make a difference. And we'll be talking about those policy levers later on in the conversation. Let's turn things over to Professor Raymond, please.
Hi, thanks so much. It was amazing to hear that. You know, I've been working with tenant organizers in Atlanta and really trying to understand in a Georgia context, what does tenant organizing look like? So the model, you know, the 8 years of path-breaking work that you've done is really fascinating. I'm going to try and share screen and show some slides. Oh, I might need permissions, or I can talk without them. I'm good either way.
Try to get you permission. Hold on. I'm going to try now.
Sure, that worked. Okay, and are you guys seeing the right view? Good. So, hi again, I'm Laura Raymond, assistant professor in city planning at Georgia Tech, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. And I want to talk today about research that I've done on single family, the rise of large corporate landlords and single family rentals, and then also talk about multifamily investors and show how these firms are linked to displacement through eviction and through gentrification. I'm going to start again, just like Roberto did, with the foreclosure crisis, and talk about the decisions that were made about the hundreds of thousands of bank-owned homes, both by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you know, the GSEs, but also by private financial institutions, with what to do with all of these distressed assets. And there was a huge discussion at the time, as I recall, where people were thinking about, gosh, could we do some kind of first look program with bulk sales? Could we there was a lot of talk about bulk sales, but maybe we could do this in a way that prioritized neighborhood stabilization, prevented cherry picking and dumping of distressed properties. Could we use these for permanently affordable housing? And unfortunately, what really won out, I think, was this view borrowed from the savings and loan crisis, which was let's repair the bottom lines of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and sell these properties into the private market for as much money as possible, and with few restrictions. And then also this became a pathway that worked for private sector, financial entities as well. So this is just a chart showing the GSE's sales to single family rental firms from 2012 to 2018. And you can see on the right, there's a timeline where, Treasury, FIFA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and also Deutsche Bank, Blackstone's Invitation Homes are working together to pilot and structure these bulk sales and figure out a way of a transaction that works. And to come up with a structure for a single family rental securitization that allows private investors to pour money into this business model. And then once that was done, Fannie Mae turned around and started to invest in single family rental securitizations to stabilize that market, which is now, I think the GSEs have backed off of that, but at this point, the market is self-sustaining. So we were interested in these new corporations. Atlanta had a ton of foreclosed homes, was a hotspot for predatory subprime lending. And I was really interested in Alan Malik's typology, which linked different profit strategies for different types of firms to things that I, as an urban planner, care about, like what does this mean for residents, for maintenance, for neighborhood stabilization. And I didn't take these specific ideas, but I kind of thought we need to link the profit strategy of the firms to the types of landlords that they're going to be in neighborhoods. And then finally, all of this research was happening in the Southeast. We are a state with a very high eviction rate. We have very little in the way of tenant protections. The state has preempted any kind of local rent control. We don't have anything close to just cause eviction. And even statutory protections that exist, like duty to repair, the way that they're treated in the judicial culture of Georgia is kind of like this independent duty. So it doesn't really necessarily halt an eviction if there is a maintenance problem, or it's really difficult for tenants to even bring that to bear in a court case. And so we have just this exceedingly high eviction rate in Fulton County, which is the county that contains the city of Atlanta. There's around 35 to 40,000 eviction filings every single year. And that's about like 17 to 20 per 100, right? So like 20%. And about 6% of all tenants go all the way through the process to the end, where there's an eviction judgment and the landlord gets possession, the legal right to repossess the home. And then if you think about the spatial concentration and you talk to elementary school teachers, we have neighborhoods where 15% of all tenants are going through a full eviction and 40% are getting that notice on their door that they're about to be evicted. So extremely high levels of housing instability, very few legal protections, high poverty rates. This is the context in which we're seeing a lot of our owner-occupied housing stock turning into rental homes. So this is a map of Fulton County and single family rentals in 2015 when we first did this study. And you can see there's very high rates of single family rentals in Southwest Atlanta and Southwest Fulton. And this is more or less the geography of the foreclosure crisis. So we're seeing, the foreclosure crisis was very disruptive, and then also a rise in the number of single family rentals and large landlord ownership in these areas. So what happened to these post-foreclosure homes? They were just far more likely to be rentals. They exited the owner-occupied side of things. So if you look on the left of all single family homes in Fulton County, maybe 22% are rentals. But if a home had been through a foreclosure, meaning at one point it was part of the owner-occupied housing stock, 53% of those post-foreclosure homes by 2015 had not gone back and owner-occupied and were rentals. And then when we linked up our eviction records data with our landlord data, we started to get a picture of what types of practices these institutional investors would have. So we found a big difference between small landlords and large landlords. Small landlords filed for eviction on 6% of all their tenants, which is very high. Like nationwide, that rate is more like 2 or 3%, right? So that's multiples of what you might see in other states. And that's our small landlords who are not using the court system as much as others. Large landlords were filing for eviction against 14% of all their tenants, so if they had a large market presence. And the institutional investors, over and above just being large, bureaucratic, rational kind of firms, filed for eviction against a fifth of their tenants. And we found a lot of discrepancy within that. So if we break it down firm by firm, we see that Colony Starwood, which now operates under a different name, and it's complicated, but that's who they were at that time. They filed for eviction against over a third of their tenants in 2015. And Invitation Homes filed for eviction against 11% of their tenants. So what does this say to us? I mean, at the time, I think policymakers and a lot of people were sort of agnostic about what institutional investors would mean. And there was this thought that they would just be really big and they would have economies of scale and they would have the deep pockets needed to repair all these homes and replace all the, boiler systems and maybe pass some of these cost savings on to tenants. And I think another thought was, hey, we've had this exclusionary zoning problem. Maybe people will be able to move into neighborhoods that are, pretty much owner occupied and take advantage of those places and have access to those places. And I think what we've seen is that these firms are not just big in the sense that they are able to achieve economies of scale. They also are really effective and efficient at extracting rent from tenants and using every legal tool, which in Georgia, lots of things are legal that are not legal elsewhere in the country, but using every legal tool to extract hidden fees from tenants, to file for eviction and pressure tenants to accept poor maintenance, and to use other strategies that I'll talk about later. And so that was some of the challenge. And the other thing is that all of this was happening in the footprint of subprime predatory lending and the foreclosure crisis. So the neighborhoods that had been rocked by that major event were again being visited with these very high eviction rates and this stark loss in homeownership opportunities. And very often these tended to be our predominantly Black neighborhoods and our historically Black neighborhoods in Atlanta. Also our immigrant communities in Gwinnett County. So there's certainly a disparate impact story emerging here. And then to follow up on that story, we did a report with the Urban Institute over the summer, just looking at what was going on during the pandemic. And there's been a lot of reporting about this over the summer, so I'm sure you've heard even more concerning figures than this. But in Metro Atlanta in the summer of 2021, large corporate investors purchased 17% of all single family homes, all of them in our study area. And I've seen other calculations of other market areas that are much higher, and 53% of all the rentals. And one thing that we noticed in our report is when we broke it down by firm type, we saw really different patterns of purchases in terms of where these firms were investing, and also really stark the amount of money that they were paying. So single family rental firms were paying twice as much in 2021 as they were in 2019. And that looks different than like the iBuyers who were trying to buy homes and cut out the realtor and sell them back into the owner occupied market. Their prices weren't rising much. So there's something about the single family rental business that enables these firms to really outbid homeowners. We're seeing that these firms are no longer distressed property investors. They're not looking for bulk sales of foreclosed homes. They are out-competing households for starter homes and lower cost homes. And they're able to, I can talk through all the different reasons why they're able to do that. And I think this presents particular challenges when we try to think about how can we use purchasing strategies to retain these homes, either by nonprofits or by homeowners. It's really hard to compete either in the speed or the price with these firms. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the multifamily space around gentrification. And a little bit, this study was a comment on how the city of Atlanta was trying to measure displacement in the city, and the types of measurement tools we were using and how we were thinking about gentrification. This is pretty common in the gentrification literature to think of gentrification as like this demographic transition process where the people moving out are different than the people moving in, and slowly the neighborhood changes over time. And that certainly happens. But what we're looking at in this study is the degree to which real estate investment is followed by forced moves through eviction and then by neighborhood change. So Again, we're looking at investor apartment sales now. I want to be real careful when I talk about investors here, because pretty much anybody who's buying a multifamily building is an investor of some sort. When we say investors, we're talking about people who are directly securitizing the asset. So often the building is owned by a special purpose vehicle. And so there's a particular investment strategy that we're differentiating from others. And then we look in this study at whether those types of purchases are associated with eviction judgments, meaning forced moves, right? This isn't the threat of eviction to get you to pay your rent, but you're still going to be there a year from now. This is, we're going all the way to the end of the process and we want the tenant out, type of thing. So we're defining gentrification as this process of physical displacement, which we're measuring as eviction judgments. And we're looking at real estate investment processes, not individual choices about where they want to live and stuff like that. So what we did was we used a panel model, and we looked at whether a neighborhood that had an investor purchase predicted a spike in eviction judgments above kind of the normal rate for that neighborhood, no matter how high or low it was. And then we also said, kind of as a reality check, do we see a spike in eviction filings, which we don't associate with displacement, but we think is more about extracting rents? And then we also ran the same models and looked at non-investors. And what we found is that investor purchases were associated with a 32.6 rise in the odds of an eviction spike in the following year. Nothing happened with the eviction filings. And we looked at purchases of apartments that weren't by this certain class of investors. We didn't see any significant patterns. The other thing we looked at was what happens to the neighborhoods where people buy these homes or buy these multifamily properties. So we did what's called a difference in differences model. And if you just imagine that this black outline is like a census tract, and then each of the squares inside is a block group, so little neighborhoods inside kind of a broader neighborhood area. What we asked was, if the blue neighborhood had an investor apartment purchase, what do the demographics look like over the long term compared to their neighbors? And that's how we're kind of controlling for like overall market conditions of what's going on in that general area. And what we found is that in the 6 years after an investor purchase, there were 166 fewer Black residents and 109 more white residents. And so this lined up with a kind of story of forced moves and neighborhood change that has a racialized characteristic, which, you know, I think in the city of Atlanta is really concerning because it's a historically Black city. And, you know, we've had Black mayors for as long as I've been alive, pretty much. And so that has a lot of ramifications. But I think also we're just trying to understand using our demographic data. Like if we used income, we couldn't really say whether, oh, the recession made people lose income or they got that degree and got that better job. This was a way to really say that we're seeing real estate purchases followed by forced moves and neighborhood change. Different people are moving in than the ones who lived there before. And so we felt we were able to isolate, there's a group of investors who aren't buying apartments because they want the current income stream. They're not saying, hey, I'm looking at this apartment, I'm looking at the rents that are coming in and the costs, and I want to invest in that asset. Instead, they're looking and they're saying, I would like to make money off of this rent gap. I have a gentrification strategy where I'm going to flip this building and possibly the neighborhood, and that's how I'm going to make profits. And that just has a lot more difficult consequences for residents and for neighborhoods and for cities as well. So I think we're going to talk more about kind of the public implications, but for me, some of them are stop selling public land. I can't think of a single instance in which the city of Atlanta, the housing authority, the school system, the transit system have sold land and not regretted it. Land prices are increasing so much that you just hold on to your land, lease it, develop it through some kind of partnership if you can't develop it yourself, but don't sell it. I don't see in this environment that being a good idea. I think if gentrification is being driven by investor purchases, model gentrification using real estate data sets. Use your evictions data, use your county deeds data, and do it at the parcel level, the fine grained scale. So when we mapped our gentrification pattern, it was totally different than other maps. It was following a totally different, very fine grained geography of where this displacement was happening. I think continue to take advantage of opportunities for preservation and affordable housing stock, try and use programs that allow residents to purchase or first look programs for affordable multifamily apartments, which are going to be sold. I think in some context, providing legal assistance helps, but I'll talk a little bit more about the Southeast and the Georgia context and how hard it is to exercise tenants' rights in an atmosphere where there's very little legal power for tenants. And also, I think, you know, I'm surprised by the amount of mileage you get just by shining a light on a landlord. And it's very hard to identify these landlords. And in Atlanta, we've often found that public data is not being made available when it could easily be. So I always make that plea to make that data available. Obviously, I'm more concerned with things that directly affect tenants, but I think the data piece is important too. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't gone over time.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So really appreciate you presenting your path-breaking, really rigorous research that I think affirms what Roberto and Shanika have been talking about. So the direct connection between investor strategies for profiting off both single family and multifamily properties, evictions, and then gentrification and displacement. Let's please now turn to Heather, who's going to talk about her really important investigative work about some of the drivers on the policy side that result in these conditions.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. And Laura, that was amazingly interesting to hear your research and all the dots that you're able to connect with deep data. And I know from experience that that data is not easy to come by. So kudos to you for digging all that up and connecting the dots for us. So I'm a reporter with ProPublica. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom. And I've been working on an investigation into rental housing for almost 2 years now. We published a bunch of stories this year. There was one recently that I did about the software that landlords are using. Some of the biggest landlords in the country are all using to set their rent prices, and some of the concerns about whether they are price fixing using it. It's a recent story that I did, but I'm going to talk about that at the end. I'm going to start with a story I did a number of months ago that focuses on the role of private equity in the multifamily market. And when I talk about multifamily, I mean buildings that are 5 or more units typically. So we're not talking about the mom and pop landlords. We're talking usually about the big landlords. And that's become sort of a larger share of apartments, the apartment stock for the whole country. So basically, I started to look at private equity's role after doing some reporting on some of the folks that were prominent during the Trump administration. A lot of them were real estate connected for obvious reasons, looking at the Kushner's apartment business and all those deals that they were doing. And one of the things that I noticed that was strange to me was that what would often happen would be these private equity backed firms would get involved in, they were basically buying and selling these apartment buildings to each other. They would go in, they would buy an apartment building, and then just, 3 to 5 years later, they'd maybe refinance once, but then they would just go ahead and sell again. And it was like these, it was sort of small number of firms that were just passing these apartment complexes around like trading cards. And sometimes these transactions would involve thousands of apartments in multiple states. And I mean, they were really huge, big money involved, big numbers of apartments. And I just didn't understand, like, based on my understanding of how the rental market worked, how you can make a profit off of renting to people. I didn't really understand, how is this a business model, basically. And so after a little bit of research, I found that, this is basically the structure of private equity investment. And it's different even from other types of corporate landlords, like a real estate investment trust. Even though some of their tactics, their management practices may be similar, private equity is kind of in its own category. And that's because what I was, people explained to me was that typically private equity is on a 10-year cycle. What a fund manager will do is they'll open a fund, a private equity fund. They'll go and solicit investors. They'll get all this, private money, all this big dollars, sometimes pension funds, all kinds of different people investing in it. And then they go out and they pick their properties or they pick their assets to buy. And in this case, we're talking about real estate. So they go out and they go buy these multifamily, huge buildings, millions and millions of dollars each. They can be, hundreds of apartments in these complexes. And so they buy them, and then they have a fairly short amount of time where they have to make changes in order to drive the profit up more steeply than it has been rising. They want to get that profit up really quickly. And you obviously do that by raising rent, you do that by cutting expenses. But the focus on the profit has, it's because when you increase the profit, the way commercial real estate is valued, you're increasing the property values. That's like a direct way to increase the value, because their ultimate goal is to flip, is to sell these big buildings. I mean, essentially, I found this is like a big corporate version of house flipping. You're coming in, you're making some quick changes if you can, and then you're trying to get out fast and make some money on that so you can return the money to your investors. And it really is not the steady stream of rental income that is, providing your profits to your investors. The focus really is on the money made from the sale, is what experts were telling me. So I wanted to look and see, how prevalent was this, and what is the impact of the structure of this type of investment, of economic investment or financial vehicle on tenants, on people actually living in these apartments. And so I quickly found out what Laura found out about the data, that the data is very sketchy on this. It's very hard to track nationally, even though these are national and sometimes multinational companies. You can't track it across the country, what their footprint is, not easily at least, because they typically create a different LLC for every apartment building that they buy. So you've got layers and layers of these LLCs, and you don't know what the true owner is. And so public databases don't provide that. You have to kind of go on this, do some sleuthing, and so a lot of people locally have to do this, where they go in and they, maybe you ask the building staff and who's the true owner, or you look at the names and follow the names in the land records or whatever. But it's not an easy process. Although I will say that the proprietary data vendors do have this information. So if you're willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for it, potentially, and get a license with one of them, typically they make you pay a monthly fee, and it's very high. The data exists out there, so that was an interesting revelation to me. But so what I did, because I didn't have the public data and we didn't have the proprietary data, I looked at it's the National Multifamily Housing Council, which is an industry group for all of these biggest landlords, and they do a top 50 landlords, top 50 owners, top 50 managers, top 50 developers every year. It's like a big deal. It's a survey that they do. And what I did was I took that top 50 for 10 years, and I looked up the financial backing of each company on there and sort of tracked, back where they were getting their funding from. And I was able to figure out which ones there was a stream, and there's sort of different structures, different ways it can look, but essentially I was able to figure out which ones were pulling off of a private equity fund from somewhere. And so I went back a decade, and I found that private equity is now the dominant form of financial backing among the 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. And what I found was that, we ended up having to do 35 because there was a methodology change. But in 2011, about a third of the apartment units held by top owners were backed by private equity, and a decade later, half of them were. So that's a pretty significant change. And this is just this top slice of the market, but it's a good part of the market because these guys own so much that top 50 owns, I think it was about 10% of the multifamily market. So you're getting a pretty good look at what's going on if you're looking at these top players. And cumulatively, the top 35 held roughly 1 million apartments last year, according to the analysis. And that's likely an undercount because there are a few big firms, private equity-backed firms, that don't participate. I don't think Blackstone participates. So, the next question is, so what's the impact on tenants? And it's sort of what you might expect or what you might have seen locally. Advocates were telling me that there were a lot of private equity firms that were squeezing their buildings in problematic ways. There were steep rent increases, there were fines and fees that could be predatory, unfair, sometimes even illegal, neglected repairs, failure to maintain amenities, aggressive use of eviction, as you were talking about. And, there was a phrase that I came across, re-tenanting, where the private equity firm would come in, they would buy the building, and they would force out all of the existing tenants and completely replace them with a new set of renters who could pay at a higher tier. And we found an example in Houston where private equity bought an apartment complex where tenants had been, according to the private equity firm, they'd been either delinquent or paying below market rates. And every single one of the renters was gone within a year of this purchase. And the firm's profits went up dramatically, through eviction or just by leaving. So the story that I did traced what happened in one building in San Francisco after a private equity firm, backed firm, bought it. There were rent hikes, there were neglected repairs, there were appliances that were not fixed. They were, tenants told me they would, their refrigerator was breaking, so they would have one, the building staff would shuffle the appliances around from other empty apartments into their, instead of fixing it or buying a new refrigerator. And at one point, this one tenant, she'd had a leaky fridge and they moved it out, they moved another one in, and then there was a problem with that one too. And so they moved that one out, and then they moved another one in, but it was her original fridge. She put some stickers in it for her kid, and she was like, "Oh wait," and it still hadn't been fixed. This was in a high crime area, but security, they cut back on that. The building department had to get on them about boilers. This is a new building. They had to get on them for boiler problems. The people were waking up without hot water on multiple mornings. But despite all of these problems over the time period that we looked at it, the firm, which was Greystar, their profits went up 24% during that time period. It's like 1 or 2 years there that we looked at. And I think it was actually 1 year. And so they went up 24%. So a financial expert told me that's a pretty sizable increase. So from their perspective, I guess this building wasn't doing too badly. So the reason I focused on this building was because it was part of the largest multifamily deal that Freddie Mac had ever done with a single borrower. This was part of a $1.8 billion deal. And just for people who don't deal with Freddie Mac every day, what they typically do, what Freddie and Fannie do, is that they buy, just in the multifamily market, it's the same as a single family. They buy mortgages off of banks. The bank makes the mortgage, Freddie Mac buys it, and they end up selling it off to investors as bonds. And the purpose is to free up more funds for the bank so the bank can make more mortgages. So it's a very important part of, without Freddie Mac backing these deals, and these deals are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over the last 5 to 10 years. These deals wouldn't have been able to happen this way. These big multifamily deals, if Freddie had not had such a big role in this market, is what people had told me. So, and I took a look at the data for Freddie Mac's 20 biggest deals that they had ever done, financing apartment complex purchases by a single borrower. And I found 85% of those top 20 deals that they had ever done were with private equity firms. And all of them, all those deals, except for one, had happened since 2015. So this is fairly recent that these like humongous super deals were being done with these thousands and thousands and thousands of apartments. And what we basically found was that Freddie Mac was helping fuel this expansion of private equity in the apartment market pretty directly. And they were doing so without requiring any tenant protections or anything like that as a condition of their financing, which is something that they have been pressured to do and have done for mobile home parks in recent years because of some of the concerns about the way people were being treated who lived in those parks. So, basically that story, I think I have a couple more minutes, but please just cut me off if you need to. That story led me to the second story, which is explaining how, private equity was able, a lot of these firms are able to come in and raise rents so much. What I found, I had a tenant reach out to me who discovered that a company named RealPage was collecting data from landlords about their rent, about their actual rents that they were charging, not what was advertised on apartments.com, but what their actual rents were, which is usually private information. So they would collect this from the landlords, and these landlords were also paying RealPage for its algorithm, for its pricing software, and the software would recommend a price for available units. So, this is sort of pricing software like maybe we're a little bit familiar with airlines, hotels, things like that. But what's different about this setup is that you've got this massive trove of private competitor data that is being used to recommend prices. And that competitor data is, geographically coded. So it's very, it tells you what your competitors within a few blocks, within a few, up to a mile maybe. It's not just, market data for the city and how, whether rents are going up or down, but it is able to tell landlords basically what is happening in their submarket, in their very small local geographic market. And so there's some, this tenant was concerned that this was anti-competitive behavior. And there are some legal experts who say, that this may essentially be facilitating a type of cartel among some of these largest landlords, because there are so many of them that are using the software at this point. And I quickly learned that this was a favorite tool of some of those private equity backed firms that I had been looking at earlier in the year. So essentially, it appears that this software may be transforming some rental markets by artificially inflating the rent level above what are competitive levels. What I found in a zip code in Seattle was that there were a little more than 9,000 multifamily apartments. So in these bigger buildings, about 9,000 apartments. 70% of those apartments were controlled by just 10 property managers. That's how concentrated the property management market has become in some markets. So 10 managers, okay? And every single one of them was using this software, this RealPage's pricing software. And the company is actually taking credit for rent hikes. They, I found this video from a conference last year where they've got a couple of executives talking, and they're saying, hey, we've never seen, rent is climbing so fast. We never before we've seen these numbers. They're talking about apartment rents that had shot up recently in a fairly short amount of time, 14.5%. And one of them executives turns to the other one and says, well, what role has our software played in this? And the other one says, I think it's driving it, quite honestly. As a property manager, very few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually. They also have marketing material that promises clients that they will outperform the market by 3 to 7%. And there are testimonials on their website of sometimes clients getting even better results from that. There was one student housing provider. There was recently a lawsuit filed about, after our investigation published about the effect in student housing. And this one student housing provider said that in 2017, 2018, that when they started using the software, they found that one 576 bed complex outperformed its market by 14.1%. Despite a negative occupancy change year over year. And that's one of the things that the company recommends, is to be willing to settle for a lower occupancy in order to raise rents. You may have slightly less demand, but the amount you're able to make from increasing rents makes up for that. So there are some people who are concerned that they are actually restricting supply as well as raising prices. Just a couple other features of the software, that work, one of the features that is most concerning to antitrust experts is that it's using this private private competitor data in order to set these prices. That's something that has been problematic in court cases, antitrust cases before. Also, the company is organizing these user groups for clients where they get together and they talk about the software and how to improve it, how to make it better. And these are people who are normally competitors who are getting together at conferences, quarterly conference calls. So since we published, there's been 3 letters by Congress members asking the FTC and the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, to investigate RealPage. There have been 3 class action lawsuits on behalf of renters filed alleging that this is price fixing. The company says that they use aggregated market data from a variety of sources in a legally compliant manner. And they note that landlords in the past have often relied on phone surveys in order to find out what their competitors are charging, and they say that that's a higher risk of collusion and that their software actually reduces the risk of collusion. So that's kind of where they come out on that. I think that's most of what I have, but I'm happy to answer questions or talk more about Freddie Mac.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I think both these stories really come together and have been like incredibly important reporting for the field to help us understand that this dynamic that we're all talking about of speculation, the role of private equity in driving evictions and bad housing market outcomes, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are policy and there are technological drivers to it. And we're going to be getting to that in just one second. So I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to see if I can share screen.
While you're sharing, David, I think one of the overarching things to consider is the absence of government on the one hand to regulate and the participation of government on the other hand that's helping to further some of the activity that we're talking about.
Right. So there are those two sides of the coin for us to consider. So definitely want to get into those policy solutions, but wanted to point to some research by LISC that relates to this topic. Before I do so, Denise, I'm not sure if she mentioned in her introduction, also has a very powerful reflection on the role of predatory investments that was just published on the LISC blog, I think on Monday. And we'll be sending that out to everybody, but really recommend that everybody takes a look at that. This work that we've done, though, and my co-authors are listed here, is a collaboration with the University Neighborhood Housing Program in the Bronx, who has for some time really been leaders in analyzing the connection between housing finance and housing justice. And we've been talking about data, how hard it is to collect. They've been doing this for the early 2000s, have been collecting information, not just on sale prices of multifamily, so buildings of 5 or more units in New York City, but also information about debt that's recorded on these properties. And they link these data to housing maintenance violations that have been recorded by the city. So what we did is we built on UNHP's database to create a quantitative measure of how quickly an apartment building rose in sales price and also how much additional debt it took on when an owner refinanced. So Heather just spoke about house flipping in the multifamily market. That's one really important way that investors realize profits. But debt is another major way that they do that. And it's kind of counterintuitive for the ordinary homeowner. Mortgage debt is something you take on as a last resort. It's an obligation to be paid. But it's not how it works for speculators who, when interest rates are low, will refinance, take on more debt, and then use those funds for more profitable investments. That's an important way that they realize profits. And the strategy is illustrated in this diagram. A building purchased in 2014 for $1 million for $250 in equity and a loan of $750 is reappraised in 2019 for $2 million, which lets the owner refinance, increase the debt from $750 to $1.5 million, and with those additional proceeds, purchase a new property that's worth $3 million. That's just an illustration, but in the report, we actually quantify that to use both increased sales price as well as increased debt to ask questions about where the greatest returns in the New York City market have been realized, the consequences to tenants of in terms of housing quality and evictions of those practices. And finally, building on a database of subsidized housing from an OU's Furman Center, we also explore the impact of affordable housing investments in promoting positive outcomes for tenants. That's the solution side of things that Denise was talking about earlier. So in a nutshell, not surprising to anyone on this call, we found that the greatest returns on real estate investment from 2003 to 2020 were realized not in ultra wealthy neighborhoods of Manhattan, but in places like the Bronx, where the child poverty rate is about 40%. And we also found that extracting these profits from buildings demonstrably harmed the tenants who live there. So buildings that appreciated the quickest, which in our research was a threshold increase of about 30% annually in sales, or about 50% annually in debt, had up to 2.7 times the number of housing maintenance violations than buildings that didn't. And they successfully evicted. So these are Marshall's evictions, completed evictions, not threats, as Laura was saying earlier. But they successfully evicted their tenants at 1.5 times the rates of similar properties in comparable neighborhoods. So we didn't focus specifically on the role of private equity in the report, but one case that we did mention relates to a portfolio of more than 1,000 units in East Harlem called the Donny Day portfolio. It was previously owned by Stephen Kessner, who was called one of the city's 10 worst landlords by the Village Voice. It was bought in 2006 by the international real estate firm Donny Day for $225 million. Donny Day had a reputation for lavish art and yacht buying, and they collapsed in 2009. But this portfolio was acquired in 2016 by the Emerald Equity Group. And published reports suggest that Emerald Equity attempted to report undocumented households and create unbearable living conditions through illegal renovations. All in the while, and according to our preliminary analysis, taking out an additional $150 million in debt on the properties and several others that they acquired in the Bronx. And these properties, at least as we could identify them, and we've all been talking about data challenges, they have about 7 times the number of housing maintenance violations per unit as the rest of New York, and successfully evicted their tenants at about 2 1/3 times the rates of similar properties in comparable neighborhoods. But the story that we tell is not just a negative one. As I mentioned, we combine these data with a roster maintained by NYU's Furman Center on affordable housing investments. And we found that affordable housing, despite the stereotype of not being well maintained, is actually in better quality than other units, including luxury housing. And they're also less likely to be acquired at higher values or take on higher debt levels. So they're taken out of the cycle of speculation that we're all talking about causes so much harm. And so based on these analyses, we make recommendations that are related to tenant protections, to resources for acquisition to bring housing into community and nonprofit control, around code enforcement, exploring ownership transfer, taxation, and lending related policy. And we're going to get to the panelists' thoughts about these policy levers in a second, but I'm just stepping back and appreciating everyone's contributions today. Really want to just emphasize the point that those who have profited the most in the recent housing market are also the ones who have demonstrably done the most harm. And so we need to be careful about that dynamic in the months going forward, and draw attention to the solutions that tenants and advocates have been proposing that really, we know, result in better outcomes for tenants and communities. So with that, let's please open to the panel. Really want to hear from you. We've heard about the policy drivers for speculation itself, for the things that really allow and in some cases encourage private equity to reap major returns from the market. And so want to give you a chance to dig in more to any of the things that you started to allude to in your earlier talk. And also to point to things that you see as the most promising kinds of solutions to these challenges. So really to anyone who wants to first jump in.
I'll just jump in because I saw a couple of questions about what the software is called. It's the company's name is RealPage, and the software has been known as YieldStar, but they also bought their biggest competitor 5 years ago, and they were allowed to do so by the Justice Department, which was called LRO, and they've rebranded. They call it now AI Revenue Management. So if you hear any of those things, it's probably pretty much all pointing to the same thing, which is this pricing software.
I can't emphasize enough oh, sorry, we're gonna go, Laura?
Oh, I was just getting ready to make
Okay.
sure I didn't talk on mute after you.
I can't emphasize enough the amount for pattern recognition and movement building. Because if you look at how we organize against a small corporate landlord, 69 buildings, versus how we organize against private equity, we're seeing some differences, but a lot of similarities. One is we're always going to get material wins for tenants. And so the tenants that come and organize in our circles are winning. They're winning from these big haven brooks. We're seeing big payouts for them. And we're actually seeing transfers of homes. They're moving into remodeled homes. And at the same time, we've been able to halt evictions in the portfolio in the north side of Minneapolis for the most part. If we weren't there, we know it would be a lot higher. We're also seeing the necessity to stop displacement and give tenants the opportunity to decide what they want. We have people in corporate portfolios who have lived in their buildings for 23 years, right? These people are from these neighborhoods. They've lived here and they've seen it all. And so how do you stop displacement? By bringing movement together. Something that's very unique now, though, is we have the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, that is launched a lawsuit against Havenbrook. So we've teamed up with some big public players, big public officials, to actually push for a different kind of solution. But we're seeing a counter revolution. Yes, a corporate landlord that's small, 69 buildings, it's big in a market like Minneapolis, but it's small relatively because you know the owner. You can go to their mansion. You can deliver them Christmas cards on Christmas. You can actually go and disrupt their living environment. When you talk about private equity, it is unknown. It is unknown. Of course, there's Don Mullen is the owner of Havenbrook and Progress, whatever. You can do this stuff, but it's so much more intense. And now they have unlimited resources, and they are killing us by their legal strategies right now. Mass subpoenas, mass subpoenaing the renters that are winning. And so you're seeing a counter offenses after we've actually won deep material wins. And so I think the consistency in the portfolio, they probably want us to go away, but we will keep being that small little pebble in their boot. And they do bend. They do bend to what we need, but in mass, they're obviously not doing this across the country, maybe in a small little place. So then how do we, Gulliver's Travels and get these like small little massive movements everywhere to take down the beast?
Thank you. It's a beautiful
I just want to
reflection.
say that, first of all, I'm so inspired by the work you guys are doing, and I really, really want to dig in much deeper and think about how we can strategize in Atlanta. And I'm sure other people are thinking about their own cities and ways that we can learn from what you've done. It is really frustrating to me the degree to which the GSEs are supporting this. And I think we really have an opportunity right now to apply pressure to federal policymakers. And it's hard. There's different frameworks for evaluating what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should be doing and evaluate the problem. And some people don't really see private equity as being qualitatively different from another type of landlord. So I think that conversation needs to be made a bit more forcefully while we have the time. And I really appreciate, Heather, what you kind of revealed about Freddie Mac's role in private equity and multifamily. I hadn't understood the degree to which that was a main driver.
It's very important. And I do think that a national movement around this discussion and calling it out and conversations with this administration about the role of private equity. Mayors are helpless, completely and totally helpless. And because they don't know, I mean, Laura and Heather, you guys are going in and doing research and digging through to find like solutions and to call up the story. But the mayors are really helpless. It's not until the inventory is completely gone, or in some cases, the speculation leads to the abandonment, that they start to have to now step in and carry this. So I think that hopefully this dialogue here and more organizing, to your point, Roberto, around the country will call this issue to the floor. This, by the way, is just another version of what was happening earlier before the 2008 crisis. It's just really another version. We were involved in organizing in New York back then, and along the lines that led to the preservation of thousands of units in the city that were coming out of the regulatory period. It's a different form of capital, it's a different set of players, but in the end, this speculative market is not going to hold up. The values aren't there. And so we're going to end up with massive swaths of real estate across the country that's completely unstable. Some of it may end up becoming occupied by much higher income people, but a lot of it is not. That's not what's going to happen. And so we're going to find neighborhoods where we have a serious housing crisis, almost another kind of bubble. And so I think that this panel is really calling attention to just how much of a crisis we're in. Really, thank you for this. Is really great. It's a great discussion, David.
You know, something that we've been exploring a lot since the start of our organizations 8 years ago, every single place that we've organized has been bought or sold. And we've either forced it into public hands again. We've had some city buildings that we've kind of pushed. A nonprofit landlords come in, a better landlords come in. We've redeveloped some homes in a community land trust, and now we're doing this cooperative over the scale of 5 buildings and 69 units. But we do understand that organizing in people power is going to force decisions of those who hold property. And this allows for a space to create self-determination and autonomy. But the people need to be ready to take power in that, and they need to understand we need to work culturally together of what that means together. Because yeah, we can push the city to say, okay, let's make new public housing. There's a 20,000 person wait list for Section 8 in public housing in Minneapolis. If they were to buy these 215 homes, how would we radically rethink the department, city planning, economic development, to actually put these homes into people's livelihoods, into generations that are going to move? And something that we saw is that we have stabilized some homes that we have to take them out of the market. So I love what you said, Laura. Don't sell. There's a Cuban economist that says, if you find oil, don't even drill for it. Just leave it in the ground. It's the same thing. Do not sell the property and get it out of the market to think publicly of where we can go in a different way. And I'm curious, Shanika, too, over the course of the organizing, how have you seen the treatment of them? And it looks like Shanika jumped off there. Okay. But how the treatment of private equity of certain individuals when you organize is compared to the mass portfolio.
Yeah, we'll be sure to get back to Shanika when she jumps on. You know, I think this relates to you know, what Denise said at a moment ago about, you know, a speculative bubble that she's concerned about that's rising, just as we saw it in 2008. I'm kind of interested in panelists' thoughts about the current economic environment. So we talked about debt being taken on to properties when it was relatively cheap, but rising interest rates are changing the calculus right now. So are rising home prices. And there are you know, continued concerns about a recession. So are there, where do you think things are going right now in terms of the speculative market, and in particular the role of private equity, and where do things need to go? And are there any opportunities that may come from these lessons that we learned from the 2008 crisis in particular, that could provide some direction about where we should be going right now.
I'll hop in quickly and say that a lot of times people who care about neighborhoods and tenants pay attention to what's going on in what I call the primary market. Like what's supply conditions, what are home prices? And a lot of these investors are really thinking about the secondary market, and they're thinking in terms of spreads. And I think we also need to pay attention to the degree to which they can outcompete homeowners or small nonprofits. No matter what the macroeconomic conditions are, they will always be faster. When interest rates are low, that's fantastic for them. When interest rates are high, well, they can pay cash and finance things much more cheaply than your, mortgage borrower who's looking at 7% interest rates, and prices dropped at the same time. So, there's ways that they can finance these deals that work in a variety of different markets. I think a lot of people made a correlation equals causation mistake where they said, oh, we started noticing single family rentals exploding during the affordability crunch. Well, I never saw single family rental purchases happening in Boston and San Francisco and Manhattan, right? It was Sunbelt cities, elastic, construction friendly places. These firms have a great excitement and business model around build to rent. I don't think that we can build our way out of this. I don't think that I'm all for new housing. I'm not trying to say don't build housing, but I'm saying it's not going to solve this particular problem. So I guess I'm sort of talking to people who kind of think first about, well, we just need to upzone and that's going to solve this. It's not going to change. And I can't think through all of the ramifications of high interest rates, but I will say that if I had to bet, private equity firms are still better poised to amass more inventory in this environment than homeowners, and that's probably what counts. And that's why I think, Roberto, to go back to this kind of question of ownership, housing is a basic necessity. And I'm all for markets in certain circumstances, but not when it means denying people basic necessities. And to the extent that people can't outcompete corporations for a basic necessity, and we don't sell water this way, we don't sell air this way, housing should be on par with food, water, things like that. We can't have these speculative cycles in something that people need every single day to survive.
Thank you. So I'm turning to some of the Q&A. I think this is for Roberto, though others should also feel free to chime in. Lots of questions about just where do you get started in terms of organizing? If you're a tenant, of a private equity-backed landlord or just an abusive corporate landlord, look, what are some first steps that you might be able to take?
You just got to sit down and break some bread together. We used to meet every Friday with pan dulce and coffee, and we got together and listened to what was happening. And we listened to what was happening together. And that doesn't matter if there's 2 tenants in the room or 100 tenants in the room. People need to see each other. And so we have to bring people together and listen to what are our experiences of isolation. And that builds up community, and I promise you, there will be a hole in the wall that you will see through the other side as to what the next steps will keep going and organizing together. Of course, we now we have a staff of 18, and we hired researchers to study Havenbrook, and we decided what portfolio to go into and why and all this kind of stuff. But I think in the beginning, it's listening to what the problems are of our neighbors, it's having in building meetings, and it's moving from there.
That's terrific. Are there positive notes to end on? I'm thinking that we've gotten some of those questions also from the Q&A. Sort of like examples And Denise, I'm sure you have several of tenants coming together of the affordable housing community coming together to acquire property and really take things out of the hands of speculative landlords. So either Roberto from the Sky Without Limits fight, or Denise from others, anything that you can sort of leave us with about success cases to build on.
Roberto is right. Organizing works. We've seen it happen. There are thousands of units across the country that are affordable today because of organizing. Many of the low-income housing tax credit units in many cities, especially that was preserved, rehabs, probably came from organizing toward that end, and that's how the investment led to tax credits. So what I would say is that a call around investing in organizing is something that the philanthropic community could consider and government could consider. Because the infrastructure that is needed, what Roberto is talking about, when he started, you can do the hanging out and getting to know each other, but at some point you have to be able to analyze the data, you have to be able to go deep, you have to put boots on the ground, you need shamikas everywhere in order to be able to be effective in this work. It's labor intensive, you have to take the long view in terms of how you organize, but it can't be, you can't do this on air. You need to, these organizers need to be financed. And so I think I would call on philanthropy and government, if we care about this, a solution towards solving it and mobilizing community engagement and saving their neighborhoods could be to put more resources. CDBG can fund some of this work. It has historically in some cities and other government resources, but also the philanthropic community, at least in New York, once upon a time was extremely active in organizing around rebuilding New York City neighborhoods through organizing. So there are models that we can share.
That's a great note for us to end on.
I would love to have this panel continue this dialogue, David. So maybe we can invite these folks back because they haven't said everything. I know that there's more that they want to tell us. And I'm certain when the news gets around about this discussion that more people are going to want to join the audience. And so maybe we find a way to do this conversation. We can make it a bit more interactive so the audience can jump in sooner. But you guys are fantastic for the work that you're doing, and we look forward to supporting you as you continue to do this work that's so sorely needed.
Yes, thank you so much. We'll look forward to more from everyone, and just grateful for the panelists. Thank you so much, Denise, and everyone who's attended. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, y'all. Have a beautiful day. Appreciate y'all.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.